So awesome. Thank you everybody for making time to participate in this panel, Wildfire to Community Resilience. My name is Allie Rosenbluth. I use she and they pronouns, and I'm currently on the territory of the Takelma and Shasta peoples, or also known as Talent, Oregon. I'm the campaigns director at Road Climate, which is a grassroots climate justice organization based in Southern Oregon, and I'm going to be moderating the panel today. Before we start, we have announcements about Spanish interpretation, so I'd like to turn it over to our incredible Spanish interpreters who will be offering Spanish interpretation for folks who would like that.
Hola, buenas noches a todos. Yo soy Aileen y estoy con Jamie. Vamos a ser sus intérpretes esta noche.
Good evening. We are here. I am Jamie, and that was Eileen who just presented herself. We're going to be with you this evening.
Queríamos decirles cómo tener acceso a la interpretación.
We wanted to tell you how to have access to interpretation.
Así que si están en una computadora, abajo de su pantalla van a ver el icono de un mundo. Hacen clic en el icono del mundo y eligen el idioma en que quieren escuchar.
So if you're in a computer, at the bottom, you're going to see an icon that looks like a globe, and you can click on the globe and you can choose the language that you want to listen in.
Si están usando su teléfono celular, abajo de la pantalla va a haber el icono de 3 puntitos. Hacen clic en los 3 puntitos, eligen la opción de interpretación y después eligen el idioma en que quieren escuchar.
If you're on your cell phone, you're going to see 3 little dots at the bottom of your screen. You can click on those and then you can choose the language that you want to listen in.
Si tienen algún problema o alguna duda para los intérpretes, pueden escribirlo en el chat dirigido a Jamie o a mí.
If you have any problems with interpretation, you can send a chat to either Eileen or me.
Gracias.
Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Gracias. All right. Could the host spotlight my video again? Great. Thank you so much. Okay. So this September, climate change hit my community in a very real way. The Alameda fire burned thousands of homes, buildings, including the Road Climate office, which is pictured behind me, and displaced many in our community. Yes, I work for a climate justice organization, and climate change burned down our office. Yet we are continuing to organize to support our community through this tragic event, to stop fossil fuel infrastructure like the Jordan Cove LNG export terminal and frack gas pipeline, and demanding a Green New Deal for Oregon. When people say climate change is real, this is what they mean. We can see it, we can smell it, feel it in our lungs as a dull ache. 2020 has presented multiple existential threats disproportionately leveled at Black people, Indigenous people, and people of color. The fires are the latest in a long line, from police brutality to tear gas at protest to a mismanaged pandemic. And now a summer and fall of devastating wildfires across the West Coast. We have an excellent panel of speakers today, and I'm so excited for y'all to hear about their experiences and their knowledge on this issue. So first off, I would like to introduce Brenna Bell, who is bringing her work as a lifetime passion for the Pacific Northwest, 20 years of organizing experience, and an extensive background in environmental law and education. Brenna is currently working as the policy coordinator for the Portland-based BARC. Brenna has worked with numerous nonprofits and is the co-founder of the Tyrone Life Community Farm, a community sustainability education center. Thank you so much for being on, Brenna. My first question for you is, what has this fire season been like for you?
Thanks, Allie, and hi to everyone who's watching. And this is a hard question. Each of us panelists get to answer it because we all lived through something rather epic this year. I come in with a bias towards fire. I love natural systems. I love ecological processes. And honestly, When the first wave of fires hit in Oregon in August, and they were lightning ignition, moving slowly through the landscape, I was just psyched. And then came our Labor Day windstorm and the fires that happened. And my initial reaction was, woo, more fire. And that quickly changed because it got scary, because those fires were moving really, really fast, and they were consuming everything in their way. And in their way were a lot of homes and towns, communities that I know and love that got burned. So I got scared for what was happening, out there. And then it started hitting even closer to home as the fires just were sweeping towards where I live in Portland. And I live on a farm. And anyone who saw my picture on the publicity knows that I have a goat. I have an actual whole goat herd. And one of the things that happened was I needed to start thinking, what do I do with my animals? Where do I take my herd? And my farm stayed on level 1 evacuation, but many did not. Many people were just hit with this need to evacuate immediately and move their lives, their animals, their homes out if they could. And then there was the smoke, which I think all of us will talk about because it hit hard. I have an asthmatic housemate who tried to escape the smoke. For 2 days, he drove every direction and could not get out of it. You could not leave the smoke.
Ella manejó en todas las direcciones, pero no podía escapar el humo.
And, it kind of ended with
Y terminó
numb despair, where when all the news of all the
en
losses
que
started,
todas las noticias de todas las pérdidas.
and I'm hearing Spanish. I'm not sure if I need to do something.
1 second. I think the interpretation got turned off for a second because folks were making sure that it was working. So let's just make sure the interpretation is back on. So I think it should work now. Let's try. Brenna, if you want to keep sharing your story, I think interpretation is figured out. Thank you.
That's great. And I realized I was speaking fast because there's so much to say. So I will slow down also for the interpreters. But I'll just end that by saying, I think the last in that, all of that happened, that story all happened in the span of about 2.5 days. It was rapid, it was intense, it was scary. And then finally there was just this kind of despair when I started hearing stories of the Alameda fire. I used to live in Southern Oregon and have such a heart for the communities down there, whole towns up by where I live. One of our elders in the forest community refused to leave his house and got burned up along with his beloved forest. So there was so much loss. And I heard someone say that Oregon is a small enough state that everyone knows someone who lost their house, who lost their community, who lost a loved one. And it has hit us all hard. And it brought fire from a more abstract ecological policy thing that I work on a lot to just a devastating humanitarian crisis. So that's a bit of how I've navigated this fire season.
Thank you for sharing that, Brenna. So my next question for you is, what can you tell us about the driving factors behind this year's wildfire crisis?
I sure can. And for this, I'm going to be, I think, the one panelist who's giving you all a little PowerPoint. It'll be short, I promise. But I wanted to begin from the beginning, talk a little bit about how we got to where we are in fire. And that, of course, starts with acknowledging that we are all on stolen land. I am speaking to you now from the land of the Muckleshoot people. I'm at my mom's house where I grew up. And I usually am talking from the land of the Tualatin Kalapuya people in Southwest Portland. And it's so important that we recognize the history of land theft and land stewardship of this land, because it influences everything. It influences all the ways our systems work. It influences the ways of who has power and access to land, how that land has been managed. And it's something that continues to be erased. And it's, I think, part of the importance of us understanding land and ecosystem and culture is understanding the relationship that we have to being on stolen land. So I invite you, if you don't know whose land you are standing on, to figure it out, to find out, and learn more about not only the history, but the contemporary work that Indigenous people are doing on the land. And I know we get more of that soon with Margot, but it's important to the history because indigenous burning shaped these ecosystems. And I will focus on Oregon because that's what I know best, but these apply to all of the Western states. And so the history of how we got to where we are now starts with the history of fire exclusion, because for time immemorial, native cultural burning shaped the West. And it was the major tool that people used to grow the crops that they needed, the huckleberry, the bear grass, the acorns. These were all very important cultural elements. And with colonization, that burning got halted, fiercely and violently halted. And so the first step on the path to where we are now was the exclusion of cultural fire on the landscape. And then after that exclusion, my slides seem confused. They're supposed to be going, here we go, to fire suppression. And after the US government stole the land and kept it in its hands, gave some away to settlers and kept the rest to the Forest Service started managing the forests. And one of its main targets from the very beginning of the agency was putting out all fires. All fires. They had a policy that they were supposed to be put out by 10 a.m. the next morning. And along with cultural burning, there has always been a history of large landscape altering fires in the West. And there was a series of huge fires in 1910. There was the Big Burn. In Oregon, where I am, there was the Tillamook Burn in 1933. These big landscape fires that freaked people out. New settlers, newcomers to the West who didn't know how to live with fire, the timber industry who didn't want to lose their trees. So we had a combination of extreme propaganda with people like Smokey the Bear and extreme militarized attack forces to put out all these fires. And for a while, it seemed like this is something that we could do because the weather for a time was cooperating with us. And fire suppression got a helping hand because we went into a period, you can see from about 1940 to 1980, of cool, moist weather on the West Coast. So we got in our heads this really wrong-headed idea that humans actually could control fire behaviors, that we could send in the helicopters and the military armed forces of firefighters to put out those fires. But really it was the weather. And so fire exclusion, fire prevention, and fire suppression all work together with this cool weather to create this idea that fire didn't belong on the landscape. And we have now successive generations believing that that's true. And so now when we're moving back into a period of more fire on the landscape, people don't have a context to understand that this is how the land works. So I'm just going to talk really briefly about what makes fires happen. Very brief, it's much more complex. But you need to have an ignition source, fuels, especially dry fuels, and then the right climate. More and more our ignition sources are power lines. And so I think there's this intersectionality about how we produce power and how we transport power that we're looking at in terms of its relation with fire. That is, it's something that's, at least for me and our forest and fire community, something new. But most of the devastating fires in the northwest part of Oregon were all started with power line ignitions this year. So we need to think about what are the ignition sources. And the second is, how dry is your fuel? It's not really how much fuel you have. The timber industry would like us to think that it is, but the question is, how dry is the fuel you do have? Anybody who's made a fire knows that if you're trying to light a wet fire, it just won't work. But no matter what your fuel, if it's dry, it's gonna burn. And that's when we get to climate change and how climate change is really affecting our fire patterns. The main thing it's doing is it's just drying out the West. It's just drying it out. Every year of successive drought means that makes that much more dry fuel because it has less time to saturate water and a longer time to dry out. And that is what is expanding the fire season. is just our fuels are drier for longer every year. This graph shows how dry it was in the West, the beginning of September, when the big fires were moving through. And so when we say climate change is affecting fire behavior, that is the single biggest factor, is the season is just getting longer because the fuels are more drier. However, I can't stop there because everyone knows what happens when you blow on that fire that you're trying to light. And that's what we've been experiencing in the West, is extreme wind events. And now these events are not unnatural, but they are becoming more and more common, again, because of climate change, because of a complicated interaction between the climate change and the jet stream, which is making the jet stream more jagged. And that's leading to bigger weather extreme events, like the wind that we had up and down the entire West Coast that fueled all of the devastating fires. And so while all of these are natural cycles, the changing climate is making them both more common and more unpredictable and more likely to keep happening. And I do want to end though, and by just reminding us that fire destroys houses and it's been horrible, but we need to remember it rejuvenates forests and other ecosystems, that they are born of forests. So as we move forward in this discussion, let's remember to focus on solutions that affect the real crisis, which is the humanitarian crisis, and not those false solutions which would seek to manipulate landscapes that need fire to help rejuvenate them. So long answer, but that's a little bit of the history of how we got to this place.
Thank you so much, Brenna. That was super helpful context. And I noticed on your map, the Indigenous peoples was cut off right at the Oregon border, but I want to name that I also saw Yurok, Karuk, Koopa, and Paiute territories on that map, which is a perfect transition to our next speaker, Margot Robbins, who is an incredible leader in our community. Margot Robbins is the co-founder and executive director of the Cultural Fire Management Council. She is one of the key planners and organizers of the Cultural Burn Training Exchange that takes place on the Yurok Reservation twice a year. She is also the co-lead and advisor for the Indigenous Peoples Burn Network. Margot is an enrolled member of the Yurok tribe. She gathers and prepares traditional food and medicine, is a basket weaver and regalia maker. She is the Indian Education Director for the Klamath Trinity Joint United School District, a mom and a grandma. And I'm so excited to have Margot here to tell us a little bit about what this year's fire season has been like for her.
Thank you, Allie. Wow, Brenna, you really summed it up great. Thank you. So this year's fire season has been extremely smoky for several weeks on end. The smoke was so thick we can't even see across the gorge, across the river. We stayed in our houses with our air purifiers going, and there was no place to escape the smoke. You couldn't go south or east or north because there was fire all around us. The fire completely blotted out the sun for several days, and there was like this orange glow to the sky, very, very, very weird. But you know, despite all of the smoke in the air and the precautions we had to take so it wouldn't damage our lungs, all of that smoke saved our salmon. So our salmon are struggling to survive in the Klamath River because of warm water temperatures and poor water quality. And we were on the brink of another massive fish kill similar to 2002 when over 60,000 salmon died because of poor water quality. But what happened when the smoke covered the sun for all those days and days is it dropped the temperature of the river and our salmon survived. And so there was something good about it. The fire came close to us. It touched the edge of the reservation next to us, but did not come on to the Yurok reservation.
Thank you for sharing that, Margot. My next question for you is, what is the historical importance of fire in Yurok culture, and how does that factor into your work today?
So fire is a major part of our cultural lifeways. Our culture is, in fact, fire dependent. We use it in ceremony. When we lift up prayer, we send our prayers up with smoke and they're answered by fire. We also use it as a major land management tool. Our ancestral territory is about 500,000 acres, and we used fire to take care of all of that land, and our neighboring tribes did the same. So we use fire from the ocean sides up to the high country, the mountains, and all of those different types of lands benefit from fire. The plants and the animals benefit from fire. The water benefits from fire, and people do too. So as human beings, we are part of the ecosystem, and we are meant to carry fire onto the land. That's our responsibility as human beings. And at one time, we were able to carry that out. We didn't burn the whole landscape at once. There were patches of land that were burned on a cycle of burning. So when the hunters were up on the mountain and they see different environmental cues that tells them that the land is ready to accept fire and that it in fact needs it, they would light a fire as they walked back off the hill. And because everybody, all the families and the different tribes performed those kinds of acts, the fire didn't escape. It didn't turn into a wildfire because there wasn't all this brush that we see today. The basket weavers, they would burn their plots of hazel. The women, when they went to gather acorns, they would burn underneath the acorn trees, not while they were gathering, but during the fall, and especially if you burn in the night, it will not only get rid of the weevils that infect the acorns, but also the moss that are up in the canopy of the trees. And so different things benefit from fire at different intensities and at different times of the year. And indigenous people are so connected to the land that they can read those signs. They know exactly when. And when you have been on a land that your ancestors for thousands and thousands and thousands of years have occupied, you know how to communicate with that land and how to take care of each other. You know when the winds change direction, you know when the rain is coming. So all of those played into our use of fire in ceremony and for practical purposes. We use that knowledge today to restore fire to the people, that we might once again take our place in the ecosystem to help it be healthy again, to make a good place for animals to live, to leave the charcoal on the ground that purifies the water, to burn the massive, massive amounts of brush that not only people can't walk through, but animals can't get through either, to replace those invasive species with native species, and so that the people and the land will be healthy again. We are so closely tied, the health of the people physically, emotionally, spiritually, with the health of the land, that it is imperative that we restore fire back to the land to its rightful place. Some of the things that the Cultural Fire Management Council does is we do prescribed burns twice a year on our lands, and it's called a TREX, or Training Exchange. People from across the United States and even other countries come to their firefighters, qualified firefighters. They come to increase their firefighter qualifications and to help us burn our land. While they're here, we teach them about some of our cultural life ways, so that they understand that what they're doing is way more than just burning brush. And they come to realize really the true purpose of fire, and it touches them in a deep way, just like it touches us. There's something about fire that it touches your spirit. And so we have those prescribed burns twice a year on a larger level. We burn up to 167 acres in a TREX for 5 days. And our land is very, very steep. So 167 acres would be 3 or 4 times that much on flat ground. We also have started a family-led burn program. When CAL FIRE takes their fire restrictions off, we go out to help families burn around their homes and their gathering places, because this is the traditional way of burning. That's the true traditional way. When the time is right, you can go out and burn. And so that's what the family burn program is about. But we have our little slip-on fire engine, and we bring that on the day of the burn just to make sure that the fire doesn't escape its intended area. We remind people about the very different landscape that we live on than our ancestors did. Our ancestors lived more like in a park-like landscape because of the care they took of the land, and we live in more like a tinderbox. And so it's very important that people do things in a safe way. And so we help support families to do that. Our family burn program continues to grow. We also have focused a lot of time and energy in educating people about the need for fire and the benefits of fire. We have curriculum in the schools. We go into the schools and teach the young children about fire and the good things about it, and safety things. When we do our prescribed burns, we'll bring van loads of kids to come watch the burn. And when we do our family burns, it's all ages of people. Just last year, we was out here in my backyard, and I was burning with my kids and my grandkids who are as young as 3 or 4 years old. And so it's important that people understand that fire is meant to be in the hands of the people. It's not meant for just the agencies to control. We have so much work to do to restore our land to a healthy way, and to protect people's lives and their homes and the animals as well. And so that's the path we've embarked on. It's a big task. We realize that we won't complete it in our lifetime. And so this intergenerational transfer of knowledge is really key in keeping this moving forward. Thank you, Allie.
Thank you, Margot. Yeah, what an incredible program. And I know from all the stories I hear from folks in our community, how much those programs have made an impact on people and how they've really empowered them around fire too, which is something on the West we need to learn how to live in. So thank you for all that work and for sharing all that, Margot. Next up, another friend, Nidia Alicia, is a Chicana climate activist, community organizer, protector, and educator writer, and storyteller who dedicates her life to ending the desecration of Mother Earth, protecting the sacred, and defending those most vulnerable from oppression and suffering. She has been one of the core organizers of the Run for Salmon Prayer, a spiritual journey led by Chief Kayleen Sisk to defend California's water, restore salmon runs, and revitalize Indigenous lifeways. She's also a hometown of Talent, Oregon, and she's going to be, I think, sharing a little bit about her experiences this summer with the Almeda fire. So Nidia, I'd love to hear from you how this fire season has been for you.
Thank you so much, Ali. Tlasokamati, I just want to start by giving thanks to each and every single one of you, giving thanks to this day that we are here still Earthside. I know that these are really challenging times for a lot of us with everything that is going on. I'm about to go get a COVID test after this, and that is just the time that we are in. So I just want to invite anybody who is on the other side of the screen. I can't see you, but I can feel you. I want to invite us to just take a collective breath together. And just give thanks that we're still here. And as we inhale, I want to invite us into imagining a place that feels peaceful for you. This could be your bed. This could be your mother's kitchen. Any place. This could be by a river, by a creek. And just sit here with me, listening to our breath, giving thanks for breath, or trying to reach our breath. I know this time might also be a difficult time where breath is not as accessible to us, either due to grief, trauma, illness. So for those of us who do have a little bit more breath, want to invite us to take a breath for all of our life relatives, not just humans, and to just breathe and send some good energy their way in this moment. And on the next inhale, send it and imagine breathing it and bringing that breath right to your loved ones or whoever may be suffering in this moment. And on your exhale, just invite us to gently open our eyes and come back here to this virtual space that we've created for tonight. So, Kualilla Wali, my name is Nidia Alicia. I'm a Chicana Indígena Raramuri and Purépecha descendant. My ancestors come from so-called Mexico, in so-called Chihuahua and Michoacán. And it was actually the trees and the pears that called my parents here to the Rogue Valley way back in the 80s, when right around the time I was looking at that graph that you shared, it was right around that time when fire suppression was becoming a thing and the timber industry had completely taken over the care of the earth. My father was a former Northwest tree planter who planted millions of trees here in the Pacific Northwest. And my mother is a farm worker who still continues to work in these fields, harvesting food for our communities and for the world at large, because we know that our food systems have become so disconnected in the way that we eat food that comes from other people's landscapes and that is nourished by other people's rivers and that is raised by other people who we may never meet in our lifetime. And so I grew up here in this community. Our community is a mixed status community, which means that due to obviously colonization of these lands here in Tekelma territory and the lands of my ancestral territory, many indigenous people have been pushed out and moved around by this colonial way of living. And so I grew up here, and many of the community members who formed the Latinx community also came from many different parts of Central or South America, all over the world, who were also pushed out from their homelands due to foreign policy, due to climate change, due to many ways. And so our community is like this quilt that we have recreated here. We've recreated a sense of home. You know, my godmother comes from a different part in Mexico, but throughout these 30, 40 years that the Latino community has been here in Southern Oregon, we've recreated that home. We've recreated those systems, those relationships, that sense of home, because we understand that this isn't our ancestral territory. This is land that we have either come by choice, and many of us have not come by choice. So in the context of wildfires, we already know that when we're talking about climate change, when we're talking about racial justice, economic injustice, all of the justices, it is our indigenous, it is our Black, it is our queer, it is our disabled relatives who get impacted the most. And here in Southern Oregon, we saw how much COVID impacted our Latino community, because we are in a lot of ways the folks who get up to do these hard jobs of tending the earth, in a lot of ways, of serving the people food, of cleaning people's houses. I used to clean houses when I was a kid. I picked grapes when I was a kid. And a lot of our community was already in deep distress over this pandemic. So take that and add some now you just lost your home due to this wildfire. And I don't know if folks know, but a lot of 75% of the structures that were lost in the Alameda fire were mobile homes. And we know that mobile homes are the places where it's the most affordable to live. And also we know that mobile homes are places that do not get insured because they are not seen as something worth protecting. So I think your name is Brenna, right? Brenna was talking about how, you know, Oregon is so small that everybody knows somebody that's impacted. Well, how that looks like for our community is that I don't know anybody who wasn't impacted. Some of my former babysitters who are, you know, grandma, children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, all of them lived in these mobile home communities. And I know families that have been here since the 80s who lost everything and didn't even have a relative's house to go to. So it's been really difficult to navigate that, on top of ICE raids. A lot of our communities, when the fire hit, did not want to go to get help because they are in fear that, okay, I just lost my home, but the worst thing that can happen right now is for me to be separated from my family. So I know that right now there's a lot of our people who aren't going to ask for help. And there's a lot of our people who will not qualify for any of the kinds of aids that are being offered in this time. And that is very heartbreaking, because there is no net to catch humans. You know, there's so much of this bureaucracy that gets in the way with just making sure that people have what they need to survive. Another important thing that has been a challenge for us here has been that with there was already a 2% vacancy rate here in Southern Oregon prior to the fires, and now they said it's a 0% vacancy rate, but I think that number is wrong, because if you have 1% vacancy rate and 3,000 structures, livable structures burned down, I think that's a negative number. So if anybody wants to nerd out right now and do some math, feel free. But I know that the Mail Tribune got it wrong, because it's not 0%, it's way more than that. But one of the biggest concerns, like I said, is the fact that a lot of people who have stayed here have had to, you know, join with different family members, which creates the scenario of you have up to 20 people living in a 2-bedroom apartment right now. And slap a pandemic on top of that. We just in the past week saw how Jackson County, which is a really rural county, is in the 6th place right now in the state of Oregon that has the highest cases of COVID that are rising. So yeah, it's, you know, we're trying to figure out how to stay hopeful. I know this is a lot of heavy news, but I have to do my community justice that we've been doing a lot of organizing on the ground. One of the things that isn't talked about enough is how our communities, our Indigenous, Black, queer, disabled communities, are the most impacted by all of the chaos of settler colonialism and capitalism. However, our communities are also the most resilient. We have the structures mentally, spiritually, culturally, to orient ourselves to each other, to land, to community, to be able to respond in a good way. One of the moments that I most saw that visible was when I was phone baking the week after the fires, and I just kept calling families. I was like, hey, do you need a place to stay? They're like, no, I'm like staying in this really tight apartment, so just make sure that the people who are on the streets can get housed. We're okay. It's like, are you sure there's like 20 people in a 2-bedroom apartment? Like, you sure you don't want to take this hotel? They're like, no, we want to make sure that people who are on the streets right now have a place to stay. And every time we're in meetings, it is that continual reorientation to each other, to community. Like, who amongst us is the person that we need to take care of the most? And we've also seen how so me and my best friend started this GoFundMe week after the fires, and last week we actually had a community meet. 2 weeks ago we had a community meeting with some of the elders and mothers of our community, both affected and not affected, even though we all affected in some level, because your spirit's not right when you know your community or your neighbor or your friend are suffering. So I do say that in the full sense that we were all affected. But even in that circle of folks who did lose everything, we were still in the conversation of like, okay, who really needs it? Who are the families? Who are the elders who really cannot be exposing themselves to COVID, going to these places and asking for help? And that was beautiful to see the strength of our people in that moment, that even though a lot of our people are not in ideal conditions, we're still thinking about who are we missing. And some of that criteria that the community we decided together was, we're going to give priority to our elders who are at particularly high risk, because our elders don't get hired as easy. Our elders are most susceptible to COVID. A lot of our elders have chronic illness and disabilities. And we're going to give priority to our undocumented single parents, mothers and fathers, making sure that the funds that we raise can be distributed to those in our community who really will not have any way of receiving any kind of aid. A lot of our folks lost their savings in their home. We have to remember that when we have seasonal workers, undocumented people, it's not so easy for some folks to set up bank accounts. So that was another thing that was really like, wow, we can't even, a lot of our people don't have any savings to fall back on. And it's not like one millionaire is losing $500,000. He still has his other half. We're talking about the people who have the least, who are the most economically exploited, losing everything except our faith. So I do need to underscore that, because every time I leave a community meeting, I do leave in high spirits. Right now I'm a little bit like heavy, with a heavy heart, because of loss that is happening around me and the possibility of having COVID. But every time we leave these meetings, it is like people are like, I'm thankful for my life. We're just gonna get through this. I'm thankful we're alive. We're just gonna help each other. So I definitely need to underscore that, because it is a lot being thrown at us, but we also have a lot of spiritual and like love, heart power to face this and get through it together. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing all of that, Nidia. I have another question for you. I feel like you touched on the second question that I had prepared for you about the intersections of migrant justice, climate justice, and Indigenous rights. So I'm gonna springboard you another one. I live in the Rogue Valley, so I've seen it firsthand how incredibly resilient the Latinx community is, and how incredibly devoted our community is to bringing our neighbors back home. And I'm wondering what your take on making sure that our community gets back to their homes is, and how people can support that effort.
Thank you, Ellie. Well, I've been on so many of these freaking calls. There's like 10,000 different initiatives happening, and I'm like, oh my gosh, this is too much. And my same question is always like, how can we make these things accessible for our community? Like I can't be at every meeting, and we just had a big victory. The City of Talent, after many years of advocacy, finally is gonna have all of their meetings in Spanish, which is big, right? Because just think about it. Everything's burning around you, and la gente te están hablando en un idioma que tú no entiendes, y tú ves la gente que corre, pero no estás entendiendo nada. Like, it's like everything's burning around you, and you can't understand anything about where to go, what the hell is going on, or what is happening. So language access has been one of the biggest barriers to making sure that our community is at the table, making decisions about our future. And there have been a lot of conversations within our community about what does it look like for us to have more power and agency in terms of like how we will rebuild together, given that we lost everything. And we don't even know we do know that this is an example of disaster capitalism, where things burn down. We heard over the radio when the cops were saying, oh, the fire's going towards the mobile homes, let them burn. Like, so we know that our communities are always sacrificed. They're not prioritized. They're not treated as valuable. And it's gonna look like owning our own communities and owning our future by having agency over where we live and how we live. FEMA's calling families right now and doing this individual, like, we're going to place individual families. I just got off the phone with, I think her name, I don't know what her name is, but she works for the city of Medford. I was like, you can't treat us as individuals, because we do not see ourselves as individuals. We see ourselves as collectives. One of the biggest things that has been painful has been the loss of the neighborhood, the loss of your childcare provider, the loss of your homie who you could ask to help you fix your car. And it's that community loss. So like, we know that these federal solutions are not adequate for how we have reconnected and rebuilt that sense of community. So I don't know. I mean, if y'all want to like follow our little GoFundMe, we're going to be giving updates on what the community decides. I don't make the calls. I just hold the spaces with my friend to make sure that we are making the calls together and that we're moving through it as slow as we need to make sure that everybody's on board. And yeah, I mean, it's going to look like land back, right? Because this wouldn't be a problem if we could have traditional land management practices led by the indigenous people of this land. Like, fire is not something we should fear. To us, it is a sacred elder that has helped us even exist on this planet. So it is definitely about us reconnecting to our ancestral ceremonies and having that relationship to fire so that we can pray with it. I know Auntie Margot, I'm like such a fan of yours. But my great grandmother, she was Auntie Margot was talking about the management of land. My great grandmother was also, she would in Mexico, she would gather that old dry wood that just falls on the land, and she would gather that and sell it in the town to make a living. And I've also heard Chief Colleen talk about how her auntie would say, these forests are so dirty and messy. Like, the forest needs our hands and our care to manicure them, to clean that, to burn our fires, our ceremonial fires, and to cook with fire. My grandmother still cooks with fire. And I mean, for those of you who have eaten over fire, that is over fire, the food just tastes different. And I think it's the spirit of fire that gets to be in the food that you eat.
Thank you so much, Nidia. Thanks for taking that curveball question. Next up is Anthony Rogers Wright, who is the Green New Deal policy lead for the Climate Justice Alliance, has over 10 years of policy analysis, community organizing, and outreach advocacy experience. He has used his organizing to experience to advocate for social justice, campaigns including environmental justice, affordable healthcare, income inequality, and civil rights for LGBTQ citizens. So Anthony, passing off to you, what has your fire season been like for you?
Thank you so much. And I really want to send so much love and appreciation to Sister Alicia for just that grounding and all of that truth and wisdom. That was just very nourishing. So I really appreciate you for that. You know, this fire season for me and for all of our people, Black, Brown, Indigenous, poor white folk, I think has been a really just a metaphor, right, for everything that we've been dealing with, as Sister Alicia said and Sister Margot said earlier, as the colonized people of the last 500 years. We're seeing, unfortunately, in some cases, literally, but also in a metaphorical sense, right, figuratively, the chickens coming home to roost. The chickens coming home to roost of a crisis that was started when these lands that we are on were stolen through brutal land theft, through the root causes of an exacerbated climate crisis, which are, of course, white supremacy, patriarchy, and colonization. It's been extremely hard, you know, to in the midst of this pandemic, of seeing people displaced, are people who are immunocompromised because we live in frontline communities. So our health has been under assault for so long by coal-fired power plants and other extractive industries, fracking, the theft of water, the capitalist direction of water to serve profit instead of people. So it's been a lot to absorb. And then, of course, the personal stories of hearing from friends and loved ones who have lost everything. And as it's been mentioned on this call, I mean, our people don't, you know, they're not in good hands with all states. Unfortunately, you know, we just don't have the capital or the wealth for that. Things that we hold sacred but not valuable have been lost to us. Pictures of our relatives, of our ancestors, of our children, artifacts, things that were handed down to us by our grandmothers, our aunties, our uncles, and our elders, all gone, that didn't have a quantitative value, but had a qualitative value that can never be replaced, because as the indigenous folk of Turtle Island have taught us, it's about the sacred. And the sacred, you can't put a dollar sign on the sacred, and the sacred cannot be replaced. But what it's really also shown us is that we no longer can operate in this climate justice milieu in silos. There's no time to prioritize, oh, once we take care of the economy, then we'll get to justice for transgender Black women. Then we'll get to, right relationship and upholding the treaties that were made and broken with Indigenous people. And then we'll get to the lie of this country, which has never had a truth and reconciliation process regarding its stolen African descendants. So it's been a lesson, but it's also been an illumination of just how perseverant and powerful primordially the original people of this land and the people who were stolen here to work this land are and have always been. We talk about the concept of a Green New Deal. We have to go back and talk about the concept of the principles of environmental justice from 1991, when Black, Brown, Indigenous, and poor white folk got together and created a framework where, I don't like to be a Monday morning quarterback, as they say in the media, or someone who is a hindsighter. But this is 1991. Some of us were not blessed to be and walking on terra firma yet. But in 1991, Indigenous, Black, Brown elders, the founders of the climate and environmental justice movement, provided us with 17 principles that, if they would have been followed, would have put us back in right relationship with the land, right relationship, therefore, with each other, and perhaps many of the atrocities that we are experiencing, the wildfires exacerbating them, could have been averted. But we know now, at least, that is the only way forward, that this idea of commodification of everything is going to lead to more fires. I'm reminded of one of my favorite authors and biggest influence, of course, James Jimmy Baldwin, and his book, The Fire Next Time, and really asking ourselves what that means. We've been talking about, when we're in right relationship with land, fire is not a bad thing. Fire is sustenance. Fire is nourishing. Fire allows the land to transform and regenerate. Those are things that we're all about. But the fire next time cannot be massive climate catastrophe at the hands of extractive capitalism and unfortunately the settler mentality that we can stay here for a bit, use it all up, and then move to the next location. I think that the other thing that we are seeing is that our white relatives, white folk who have lost their homes, have a real opportunity in this moment of manifest empathy in lieu of manifest destiny that displaced, pillaged, and murdered Indigenous folk, and also forcing stolen people to work on stolen land. Indigenous people have been displaced by force. Indigenous people have been displaced by avarice and greed and colonialism and patriarchy. And now we're seeing some of our white allies, who will hopefully become accomplices, experiencing the same thing. And that's not something to celebrate. But if the empathy, the manifest empathy, and the exercise empathy can actually come into fruition and be used to emancipate all of ourselves, then perhaps this is a silver lining. But in the meantime, we have acute pain, but our people have always turned acute pain into chronic struggle, chronic organizing, and chronic pursuit of justice. So it's been showing up in a lot of ways. But again, I've just been continuously blown away by whether Indigenous folk on the West Coast, Black and Brown folk on the West Coast. We stand with the Shoshone and other sovereign nations of Colorado, who right now are experiencing uncontrolled fires as well. And like we saw with Standing Rock, like we saw this summer with the lynchings of George Brown and the assassination of Breonna Taylor. Sometimes, the sister Alicia referred to disaster capitalism. The author of the books, The Shock Doctrine, of course, Naomi Klein, said that sometimes in these shock events, people grow up, and they grow up quickly. And I've been seeing a lot of growing up, especially with our young folk who continue to dazzle us and ensorcel us with their power, and they're digging their heels in and saying, we're not waiting for any torch, speaking of fire, to be passed to us. We are taking it, and we are going to secure our future for generations 7 times beyond us, as Indigenous people of Africa and Turtle Island teach us. So lots of melancholy, but also lots of hope and lots of inspiration by seeing the demonstration of power and perseverance.
Thank you for sharing all of that, Anthony. And I love the manifest empathy. I'm going to keep that with me and remember it for a long time, as I hope a lot of the attendees and panelists will as well. So Anthony, I have another question for you that relates to your work as the Green New Deal policy lead at CJA. So what does a just transition and energy democracy look like? And how do the Green New Deal and principles for environmental justice offer us a framework to accomplish that?
Yeah, I really, really appreciate that question, my friend. And I think it goes back to the root causes of the climate crisis. Again, white supremacy, patriarchy, and colonization. The first thing that we would say, because you touched on energy democracy and just transition, is that what we are not going to do is replace big oil with big renewable, right? Because then we would just have completed a vicious cycle of capitalism that has us right back to the same place where we started. And the role that we're looking for right now is, as the sisters, the brilliant sisters on this call have been saying, is not commodifying energy. Not when you think about it, when Manhattan Island, which is where I grew up, was stolen from the people, when Peter Stuyvesant offered $5, the indigenous folk were like, WTF, like, what are you talking about? Like, how much do you want for this cube of air? That, this is so foreign, the idea that land and water and air and sun and wind can be commodified and turned into a commodity to be traded, on a stock market and on Wall Street, by the way, which was created to separate indigenous people from their land. That whole concept has to be eviscerated. Just transition is talking about the workers and the communities who are dependent, unfortunately, on these capitalist systems, on fossil fuel capital and revenue to survive. And that's really unfortunate. And we do all have to survive capitalism until we get rid of it. Just transition is saying that we're not going to leave those workers behind. We have an oil and gas industry that in the last 3 months have laid off 100,000 oil and gas workers in the midst of a pandemic, not honoring their pensions and not honoring their entitlements. And I say entitlements purposefully. A lot of people say benefits. These are not benefits. These are entitlements. Healthcare is an entitlement, right? Being able to put food on the table for your families is an entitlement, not a benefit, because it's an entitlement because it's been earned. So Just Transition says we're not going to forget about those workers. And energy democracy says is that rather than having this gargantuan, black snake of an energy grid that is full of extractive economy, perverse subsidies like frack gas and pipelines, we're going to decentralize that and do community solar and community wind. And the people who are in right relationship with the land and therefore in right relationship with each other are going to be in control of that. Cooperative energy models to really emancipate us from an idea that it is okay to shut off people's ability to keep themselves warm, or shut off their ability to be able to read to their grandchildren and sing songs and look in each other's eyes and do dances and whatever it is they do to celebrate that is in line with their culture. That doesn't make any sense. That if you are having a rough time, making money, that you don't have the right to heat your home or to have lights on, or in this case, to have internet. So that's what we're talking about with energy democracy. And that has to be central to any Green New Deal. And also what needs to be central to any Green New Deal is free, prior, and informed consent of indigenous people. If they're not down with it, then it probably shouldn't happen. Right? It's just like anything else. If someone comes into my house and they start playing dubstep, for instance, I did not give free, prior, and informed consent to play dubstep, so you're gonna have to turn it off or leave, the house. The free, prior, indigenous folk have not given free, prior, and informed consent for the way energy is going to be produced on their land, then it's not going to happen. Much like we saw with the struggle with the Dakota Access Pipeline, the Keystone XL Pipeline, and I'm happy to say the canceled Atlantic Coast Pipeline, which was pulled by an investor-owned utility who I like to call the IOUs, because they literally owe us so much. When you're thinking about what happened in California, this was an investor-owned utility that now has a massive IOU to many, many, many people who lost so much because of a mentality of avarice, and rather than right relationship with the land, looking at the land as a commodity. That's what a Green New Deal has to be centered in. That's what a Green New Deal has to be grounded in. That has to be the narrative of the Green New Deal, because the narrative are the seeds that everything grows out of. Our base building and organizing is our water. The plant that comes out of that is our policy development. And of course, we reserve the right to utilize direct action if free, prior, and informed consent is not being followed. Black and people are being dehumanized. Transgender Black women especially are being seen as ineffable and subject to a culture of slaughter. We will agitate against that. That also has to be central to Green New Deal and energy democracy.
Thank you, Anthony, for sharing all of that. Thank you to all of our incredible panelists. We are now moving into the next section of our panel, which are questions that are kind of posed at one member of the panel, but are open for other folks who are on the panel to contribute as well. So they're random and fun, and it's going to be a little bit more conversational. So I know the Zoom unmute yourself is awkward, but please advocate for yourself to speak up, because you all have a lot of incredible experience and information to share. So my first question, which is posed at Brenna, is what role does the timber industry play in wildfire, the intensities of wildfires that we're seeing in the West now?
That's a great question. There's a lot of things I could say. I will try and keep it brief and open to others. I think the first thing to remember is there's a lot of different types of fire. And one of the main narratives that the timber industry has been using, and the government and the Forest Service have really adopted over about the past 20 years, is that they can control fire behavior by controlling the amount of fuels that are on the ground. Which means if they, because it's the timber industry, they want to log trees. They want to take trees out of the forest. They say if there are fewer trees in the forest, then the fire will burn less intensely, and that is good. And this narrative has a lot of power. And they have been really, really pushing for logging to remove trees as a way to ensure that those trees don't burn. Well, like we saw in Western Oregon just recently, when fires are big weather-driven fires, and all the big fires are weather-driven fires, the amount of fuel really doesn't make that much of a difference. It will burn through old growth forests, it will burn through clear cuts, it will burn through plantations. It might burn differently, like the impact on the ground is going to be different. Like there are some scorched plantations that it just ripped through, but it will not stop the fire, right? Where fuels makes a difference is when you're burning, like the burning that Margot was talking about. When you burn off season, when you have a cooler fire, when you have things like that, then how much fuel is there really does affect the fire. But those are the fires that they keep putting out because they can. The fires that they can't put out are the weather-driven ones, and they just throw literally billions of dollars at these fires trying to put them out. It's like trying to put out a hurricane with a leaf blower. Like you can't do it, right? But the timber industry makes us want to think that we can control fire because we can control fuels. But what they really want to do is just log the forest.
Does anybody else want to share their take on the timber industry? Margot, I see you unmuted yourself.
Yes. So I would just like to add that the timber industry and their monospecies agricultural way of making money has really contributed to the wildfires. We have these large plantations of same age trees, and they're just like really packed in there tight. And so that contributes to it. Forests should be, have a variety of trees. There should be some space between them. And another thing that contributes to it is the law that when you log or a fire burns through a place, you have to go in and replant a certain number of trees. And that certain number is a lot. And it doesn't even matter what that landscape was once like. Maybe that landscape was a prairie and is supposed to be a prairie. But because all of the place was planted with trees by the timber industry, and they've now burned. And so we need to pay attention to what the landscape was once like and what it is intended to be, not the landscape that the timber industry has created. They've come into our territory and planted prairies with trees. So it contributes to wildfire.
Great. Yeah, and I know for folks who don't live in Oregon, the timber industry has a lot of power in our state legislature as well. And with the lack of campaign finance laws, they're able to contribute lots and lots of money to powerful people to make decisions that aren't good for our communities. So I wanted to make sure that piece was brought in as well. Thank you, Brenna and Margot. Next question, which is for Anthony, is how do you see wildfire solutions being humanitarian social justice issues? And also anybody else can add to this after Anthony does their first pitch.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Not just humanitarian issues, but balanced with life issues. Because as I believe it was Sister Margot, expressed earlier, it's not just about human beings. We when we're in right relationship with land, we're in right relationship with the plants and with all of the animals that we all depend on each other. When I was had the blessing and honor of being at Standing Rock with the great Dennis Hall, who walked on, he said we are all part mountain, we're part deer, we're part grass. So it's a humanitarian issue, number one, because of the emissions that these wildfires emit. Particulate matter 2.5 and 10 microns in diameter have all kinds of deleterious effects and impacts on people's respiratory systems, especially our elders, in the age of a pandemic that attacks the respiratory system. So controlling wildfires and making sure that, which are now exacerbated by the climate crisis, and the climate crisis, of course, first and foremost, is a humanitarian and a planetary issue for all walks of life on the planet. So that would be like, my short answer to it. But also when you are robbing people of state parks, you are also robbing people of the sacred, and nothing can be more humanitarian than preservation of the sacred.
Brenna, do you have another answer to that question? I see you unmuted yourself.
I want to build on it. I think that one of the things that we can really do is start preparing for fires, right? Rather than thinking that we can control the large fires and they're somehow unnatural, we can start preparing for them, like people prepare for hurricanes and prepare for, we kind of prepare for earthquakes here, not as good as we should. But there's things, especially, Anthony brought up smoke, and it is a huge public health issue that we could prepare for by building smoke shelters, public smoke shelters, where people could go, or getting air filters into the hands of the people who need them most, the most vulnerable populations, the people with respiratory problems and elders, could be getting air filters, and the government can fund that. Remember how I said they spend billions of dollars trying to put out fires that they can't actually put out? That money could be redirected to preparing communities to better deal with fire. And it's not, and it needs to be. So those are part, I see that kind of as part of the just transition. Look at this as a public health issue that we can work for and work toward to create these, rather than thinking that we can fight these systems of the nature that are truly just out of our hands, except for stopping climate change.
Nidia, go ahead.
Hi, this is Nidia speaking for anybody who's on their phone. Yeah, I just really wanted to underscore bold font, caps lock, what Auntie Margot shared earlier about the importance of returning to our sacred place in the web of life. And the importance of spiritually preparing ourselves for these times. Because it is no coincidence that we are here, that the ancestors sent us here for exactly to shift what is going on. And someone shared with me earlier, when I shared with them that I was going to be on some panel, they were like, oh, that's cool because it's going to be recorded. And that means people 100 years from now will probably look at it. It's like, oh, that's so cool. Like, so what do I want to say to people 100 years from now? And I think as I sit and like think about that, I would just say that it's going to be important for us to return to the land in the right way, you know, not in the way that we think, not in the way that capitalism thinks, but in the way that that we were meant to return to the land. And for those of us who are on other territories, it means following Indigenous leadership. It means following traditional ecological knowledge and listening to the messages that we are being given in these times of pandemics and of climate chaos. So yeah, that's going to be just as important, because it's a climate crisis and a pandemic and everything else, but it's also a spiritual crisis that we're going through in these times.
Thank you for that, everybody. My next question is for Margot to start. So Margot, I'm wondering, what role do you envision planned burning can have in the future and in the present?
I envision prescribed fire being one of the major tools in restoring the land and preventing wildfire. I believe that that private citizens have the right to use fire, that a combination of private landowners, government agencies, tribes, nonprofit organizations, for-profit organizations, that we can all work together to build up to large landscape level burnings that will impact the way that wildfires behave, to reduce the fuel load on the ground. It will impact how the fire behaves. We had a wildfire here. I look across the gorge and I see all the trees burnt up over there. And they evacuated that hill plus the hill that I live on. And on the other side of the hill is a elder lady who burns her land on a regular basis for hazel sticks. And when that fire went across the hill, huge, good sized wildfire moving fast, it slowed down and it went around the place that she normally burns, because there was not the fuel load there that is on the rest of this land all around it. So when we have everybody working together, putting fire on the land in a good way at the right time, at the right place, it's going to make a big impact.
Fight fire with more fire. It's unintuitive, but it is the truth. And it's been proven. And the work that you're doing, Margot, to prove it
Right.
is so amazing. Another question, I know this is on a lot of people's minds, and we've had a few comments in the chat about it, is what does it look like to have Firewise homes and communities? And maybe Brenna, you could start with this, and Margot, Nydia, or Anthony, if you want to bump in, please do.
Sure, thanks. There was a question early on in the Q&A about a fireproof school. And, you know, in all my experience doing research on this, I've never heard of someone saying that they had a fireproof building. And I think I just want to caution anybody who is saying that they might be mistaken. But there are many, many ways that we can make our homes and community more resilient and resistant to fire. There's a lot of, you know, there's a lot of different directions it could take. The first is, where do you build? And clearly, the biggest change in the past 100 years, remember 100 years ago, we had more fire. Now we're having it more again on the landscape. But the biggest change is now we have people, lots and lots of people living scattered throughout that whole landscape. And so thinking about where people are building and why, and unfortunately, a lot of it is that land has become very expensive, and cheaper land is out further in the wildland urban interface. So which communities are getting pushed out into those lands and why is a question we need to be asking. So who is building where? What are the justice issues around that? How can we ensure that if people are pushed out, then they have the resources to do the second thing, which is, you know, trying to do what's called home hardening and building your house in a way that makes it less susceptible to burning. And there are some very, very simple ways to do this. Some ways that cost more, especially if you're retrofitting. Another place where the government could work by giving people grants to do things like put metal roofs on their houses, put gutter guards, check to make sure they can't get any embers into the houses. Because a lot of the catastrophic fires that we've seen have not been forest fires. They have moved, like the Alameda fire was an urban fire. It moved from house to house to house. The Paradise fire was an urban fire. If you look at pictures, the trees are still standing, but the houses are gone. Once the fire moves into those areas and it's moving between the houses, there are ways that we can slow down the movement of those. And a lot of great research. There's a guy named Jack Cohen who has a laboratory in Montana, and he burned down houses. You know, there's people in the insurance agency industry who will burn down houses and then let people know all of the ways that they could make their house less flammable. So there are multiple things that we can do, but what we really need, we truly need, is a government investment in making homes and communities less flammable, more fire resistant, more prepared. And that's where we need the policy change to move away from focusing on the backcountry and towards looking at community solutions that really foreground, as everyone's been saying, those who are the most vulnerable and the least resourced, and give them the funds, the grants, and the support to improve their communities.
Great. Does anyone else have anything to add to that? That was an incredible answer to that question. And combined with that and the conversation around burning and our futures, controlled burning, I feel like that there's a lot of solutions that we know and that have been practiced for time immemorial that we need to look back at and incorporate into our lives. So Nydia, I have a question for you. So what do you think folks outside of the West Coast need to know about what's happening with fires on the West? And what do you think the national media isn't telling people about these experiences we're having?
Thank you, Ellie. This is Nydia speaking. Well, first and foremost, if there's anything I would want to say to anybody outside of the West Coast right now is to prepare yourself for whatever disaster you are prone to in whatever area you are. For us, that is wildfires. For you, it may be hurricanes or tornadoes. And we lost a lot during the fires, but we could have lost a lot less had we been prepared. So no one is going to escape climate change. It's going to impact all of us. There are going to be millions of people, billion, up to 1 billion, it's been estimated, in the next century, maybe sooner than that, that will be displaced by climate change. So it's important for us to prepare. And in all the ways that you need to prepare mentally, physically, emotionally, spiritually. One thing I would like to say that I would like to reflect that I touched on briefly is that we are going to need each other to get through it. And a lot of times we don't get along for petty reasons. And the thing is that we can't do this alone. We're not going to be able to respond to this alone. It's going to be hard to work together, but it is going to be impossible to work alone. And if there's something I've seen here in my community that I would like to be seen for anyone beyond the West, is that it is going to be you, it is going to be your relatives, it is going to be everyday people who are going to respond when disaster hits, because we can't count on the government, we can't count on the Red Cross. They do not know our needs better than we know our needs. So get to know your neighbors, get to know your family, get to know your community, and have a plan for how you are going to respond collectively should anything come your way. And that is what we've seen here. And I would love for that to be more seen, that it is also, this moment of deep grief is also a beautiful opportunity for reassessing what really is our priority in this lifetime. And I've become incredibly clear about what so much of my energy that has just gone to meaningless things, that now it is like, whoa, okay, pandemics, climate change, family, loved ones, earth, like get right, So the sooner we can, cleanse ourselves and get right and aligned, the easier it'll be for us. So we're all in it together, y'all. If anyone else wants to add anything.
That is a pretty perfect way to end this conversation. Being here in the Rogue Valley, just experiencing exactly what Nidia was talking about our community who is so tight, immediately responding to this to be able to support each other's needs before the fire was even over. And and that's pretty amazing. So I just want to thank everybody so much for joining us tonight. There's going to be more information about fire sent to the folks who registered for this panel. If you are not on Zoom, you didn't register for this panel, you can find it on the PowerShift Network's Facebook and Twitter page, where they'll be sharing these links out as well. And again, thank you so much, Margot, Nidia, Anthony, and Brenna. Thank you so much to the PowerShift Network and our partners who helped make this happen. Please share what you learned at this panel today with your friends and your family and your neighbors. Go get to know them, build community, and have a wonderful evening. And goodbye.
Thank you, Allie. Nice to meet you, Margot, Anthony. Well, nice to see you again, Anthony. Nice to meet you, Brenna, and Sam, and Danny, and Aileen.
Yeah, and huge
that
thanks.
was amazing, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks, all. Thank you so much. That was incredible.
Huge thanks to our interpreters, too.
Yeah, thank you for making this accessible.
Yes, and I'm sorry we all talk so fast.
We had so much to say. That was such a blessing to listen to you all share and to just be sharing this virtual space with you.